From New York, this is Democracy Now!
This decision about Afghanistan is not just about Afghanistan. It's about ending an era of major military operations to remake other countries.
President Biden forcefully defends his decision to end the forever war in Afghanistan and vows to overhaul U.S. foreign policy. We'll speak to longtime peace activist Phyllis Bennis and to an Afghan doctor who just fled Kabul with his wife and 4 children. Then the Supreme Court's allowed a Texas law to go into effect that bans abortions after 6 weeks in a major setback for reproductive rights.
Texas is set on the 1st of September to ban abortions in almost all circumstances. This is a clear violation of Roe versus Wade.
Plus, we look at why more than 300 groups are calling on the Biden administration to halt deportations to Haiti following last month's devastating earthquake. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Biden defended his withdrawal from Afghanistan Tuesday as he addressed the nation for the first time after the final U.S. troops evacuated from Kabul airport, bringing an official end to the longest war in U.S. history.
Leave Afghanistan, or say we weren't leaving, and commit another tens of thousands more troops going back to war. That was the choice, the real choice, between leaving or escalating. I was not going to extend this forever war, and I was not extending a forever exit.
President Biden said the withdrawal also marks an end to U.S. nation building. Meanwhile, the Taliban held its first press conference after the U.S. withdrawal, saying it was seeking good relations with all nations.
Neighboring
countries, Islamic countries, all countries, the Americans who were ousted from our country last night, we want good relations with them also. Because we are part of the international community, we do not want our country to be a victim of war or interference. We are on the path of peace with all nations.
With the Kabul airport now closed for evacuations, border crossings by land are expected to rise, triggering a possible refugee crisis in the region. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres also warned Tuesday of an impending humanitarian catastrophe after the Taliban takeover, with services at risk of collapsing and nearly half the population in urgent need of aid. In Louisiana, around 1 million people still don't have power as some residents start the arduous path to recovery after Hurricane Ida. Officials say only limited parts of New Orleans could have their power restored by tonight. On Tuesday, Governor John Bel Edwards told evacuees it's too early to consider returning home.
Many of the life-supporting infrastructure elements are not present. They're not operating right now. So if you have already evacuated, do not return here or elsewhere in southeast Louisiana until the Office of Emergency Preparedness tells you it is ready to receive you. The schools are not open. The businesses are not open. The hospitals are slammed. There's not water in your home, and there's not going to be electricity.
In Texas, a near-total ban on abortions went into effect today, last midnight, after the U.S. Supreme Court failed to rule on an emergency petition filed by abortion providers seeking to block the measure. The law bars abortions just 6 weeks into a pregnancy before many people even know they're pregnant. There's no exception for rape or incest. The law also allows anyone in Texas to sue patients, medical workers, or even a patient's family or friends who, quote, aid and abet an abortion. This includes a cab driver who might take a woman to a clinic. Until now, no other 6-week abortion ban has been allowed to go into effect in the United States. Reproductive justice advocates have vowed to keep fighting. The American Civil Liberties Union tweeted, quote, "This is a racial and economic catastrophe, a full-scale assault on patients, our health care providers, and our support systems." We'll have more on this story later in the broadcast. In other news from Texas, the Republican-controlled legislature has passed a sweeping voter restriction bill. The measure bars drive-through and 24-hour voting sites, adds new identification requirements for absentee ballots, bans unsolicited mail-in ballot applications, and gives new authority to partisan poll watchers. State Democrats had successfully stalled the bill for several months by first staging a walkout, then fleeing Texas to deny the House a voting quorum. Texas Governor Greg Abbott is expected to sign the bill quickly. Pennsylvania is the latest state to enact a statewide mask mandate in all schools as the Delta variant continues to fuel a surge in cases nationwide. In New York, Governor Kathy Hochul also announced new COVID measures for schools.
Our school staff, anybody who enters that building, will have to be vaccinated or undergo mandatory testing. Mandatory testing. And we're in the process of getting the legal clearance for that.
Governor Hochul previously announced a mask mandate in schools. She also said New York may extend vaccine requirements for all staff in congregate and state-run facilities. In more news from New York, the state legislature has convened a last-minute session today where it's expected they'll extend the moratorium on evictions during the pandemic, which was set to expire yesterday. On Tuesday, hundreds gathered outside the office of Governor Hochul to demand the eviction ban be extended.
We're out here not as a political issue. This is not a right, left. This is not a political issue. This is a moral issue.
Meanwhile, pandemic unemployment benefits are set to expire in less than a week on September 6 for millions of unemployed people across the country. In international coronavirus news, the European Union said Tuesday it's fully vaccinated 70% of all adults. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen urged unvaccinated people to get their shots as soon as possible to avoid a new wave in cases and stop the emergence of new variants. Despite the EU milestone, vaccination rates remain low and infections are increasing in poorer Eastern European nations. Israel is now offering booster shots to all vaccinated people, which includes children aged 12 and older. The World Health Organization has repeatedly called on wealthy nations to hold off on booster shots until poorer countries receive their fair share of vaccines. Meanwhile, less than 10% of Palestinians in the Israeli-occupied territories are fully vaccinated, according to one tracker. The Australian state of Victoria has extended its lockdown for 3 more weeks as cases continue to mount. The state's leader said restrictions will only be eased after 70% of eligible residents receive their first vaccine dose. New South Wales, Australia's most populous state, reported its highest daily rise in cases this week. In the Philippines, healthcare workers protested in Manila against government neglect and unpaid benefits. This is Robert Mendoza, president of the Alliance of Health Workers.
It is sad that many of us have died, many of us became sick, and many have resigned or opted to retire early, yet we are still kneeling before the Department of Health to give us our benefits.
In Hong Kong, a court sentenced 7 prominent activists and former legislators to jail for taking part in a pro-independence protest in October 2019. It's the latest prison sentence to be handed down for organizing against Beijing's control over Hong Kong. Human rights advocates are urging Saudi Arabian officials to stop the mass firing of Yemeni workers, a move that puts them at risk of being deported to Yemen if they can't find another employer to sponsor them. Saudi authorities in July reportedly announced new regulations requiring businesses to limit the number of Yemeni and other foreign employees on staff. Human Rights Watch says the policy could put hundreds of workers at risk of being sent back to the Saudi-led U.S.-backed war in Yemen, which has sparked the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Back in the United States, Virginia Governor Ralph Northam has granted posthumous pardons to 7 black men who were executed in 1951 after being convicted of allegedly raping a white woman. The men, who became known as the Martinsville 7, were tried by juries made up of only white men, and advocates say they were coerced into confessing. Governor Northam said the pardons do not address whether the 7 were guilty or innocent, but that they're a recognition that they were tried without adequate due process and that the men received a, quote, racially biased death sentence not similarly applied to white defendants, he said. A warning to our audience, the next story contains descriptions of sexual violence. The federal trial for accused sexual predator and trafficker R. Kelly continues in New York. On Tuesday, his former assistant, Suzette Mayweather, testified the singer exerted extreme control over the women in his life, echoing accounts from the 5 survivors who've taken the stand over the past week and a half. On Monday, a woman named Addie testified she was raped by R. Kelly in a dressing room when he invited her backstage after a show. She was just 17 at the time. Meanwhile, the first male accuser to testify said Kelly offered to help him with his musical career in exchange for sexual favors when he was 17. The Biden administration announced it was creating a new Office of Climate Change and Health Equity, which will deal with the health impacts of the climate crisis and its disproportionate effects on poor communities. Assistant Health Secretary Rachel Levine laid out the office's main goals as building community resilience, reducing carbon emissions in healthcare, and recovery and infrastructure funding. And a group of Democratic lawmakers, including Congressmembers Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, and Ayanna Pressley, are calling on President Biden to replace Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell for neglecting to take on the climate crisis and weakening financial regulations. Earlier this year, 350.org joined other climate groups to demand a new Fed chair, accusing the agency under Powell of bailing out the fossil fuel industry rather than helping impacted communities during the pandemic. Powell was appointed by Trump. His term ends next February, but Biden could soon announce whether he will reappoint him or replace him. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, we begin today's show looking at Afghanistan. On Tuesday, President Biden forcefully defended his decision to withdraw U.S. troops from Afghanistan.
I was not going to extend this forever war, and I was not extending a forever exit.
President Biden described the U.S. pullout as a, quote, extraordinary success, noting the U.S. helped over 120,000 people flee Afghanistan since the Taliban seized power 2.5 weeks ago. He called for a new era in U.S. foreign policy.
As we turn the page on the foreign policy that has guided our nation the last 2 decades, we've got to learn from our mistakes. To me, there are 2 that are paramount. First, we must set missions with clear, achievable goals, not ones we'll never reach. And second, we must stay clearly focused on the fundamental national security interest of the United States of America. This decision about Afghanistan is not just about Afghanistan. It's about ending an era of major military operations to remake other countries. When I was running for president, I made a commitment to the American people that I would end this war. And today, I've honored that commitment. It was time to be honest with the American people again. We no longer had a clear purpose in an open-ended mission in Afghanistan. After 20 years of war in Afghanistan, I refuse to send another generation of America's sons and daughters to fight a war that should have ended long ago. After more than $2 trillion spent in Afghanistan, a cost that researchers at Brown University estimated would be over $300 million a day for 20 years in Afghanistan, for 2 decades. Yes, the American people should hear this. $300 million a day for 2 decades. If you take the number of $1 trillion, as many say, that's still $150 million a day for 2 decades. And what have we lost as a consequence in terms of opportunities? I refuse to continue a war that was no longer in the service of the vital national interest of our people. And most of all, after 800,000 Americans serving in Afghanistan, I've traveled that whole country, brave and honorable service. After 20,744 American servicemen and women injured and the loss of 2,461 American personnel, including 13 lives lost just this week, I refuse to open another decade of warfare in Afghanistan. We've been a nation too long at war. If you're 20 years old today, you've never known an America at peace.
President Biden speaking on Tuesday. We're joined today by Phyllis Bennis, author and fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies, author of many books, including Before and After, U.S. Foreign Policy and the War on Terrorism. Phyllis, if you can respond to President Biden's address talking about ending this forever war and stopping a forever exit.
You know, Amy, I think that there were a number of things that President Biden said in his speech that were both true and important. The most important of which was that it was right and important to get out. He didn't say, of course, that it was wrong to have gone in the first place in a war that was illegal, that was not authorized by the United Nations or self-defense, that violated international law, that justified and normalized terrorism across the understanding of this country. But it was right to get out. The huge problems in terms of how they got out, how the withdrawal happened, he acknowledged only barely, which is a huge problem. But I think that keeping the focus on the significance of ending the war was very important, particularly because he was willing to acknowledge and really focus on the economic cost as well as the human cost. Those figures from Brown University, which my IPS colleagues at the National Priorities Project have been using for years, we've struggled to get those into national consciousness. So having that being said by the president twice, that it's $300 million a day, $2 trillion is more than anybody can even imagine how much money was wasted on that war. So that was very important. He implied that this was the end of the global war on terror. I think that was something that is clearly not true. The U.S. is still waging war in a host of other countries, including Iraq, for whose war the Afghanistan war was really initiated in the first place. It raises the question of whether his own view is that the U.S. war policy is shifting away from wars against so-called terrorism towards potential wars with China, perhaps Russia. The rise of the new Cold War tensions with China are very, very serious. He didn't reflect on that in this speech. But again, it was very important that he spoke of the legitimacy and the significance of pulling out. I think we should be clear. There's a lot of talk, and I think it's very justified, about Afghans feeling abandoned by the United States because of the nature of this chaotic and insufficient withdrawal. And all of that is true. I think what's also true is that the United States abandoned the people of Afghanistan long before this withdrawal. They abandoned the people of Afghanistan when they occupied their country, when they imposed a government that was based on U.S. understandings of what a government should look like and had nothing to do with the history, with the political culture of Afghans themselves. They abandoned women when, after 20 years of U.S. war and occupation, Afghanistan is still #1 in infant mortality in the whole world, meaning it's the worst place in the world for a woman to give birth and have her child live to her first birthday. You know, this is what abandonment of women looks like. So I think that we need to be talking about a new era. Indeed, we need a new era of refugee protection. We need a new era of turning away from spending 53 cents of every discretionary federal dollar directly on the military. We need to move away from all of that. We need to move away from any notion that a war waged for vengeance, and we should be clear, this was never about justice. This was never about bringing the perpetrators to justice. This was about vengeance and about preparing the people of this country for going to war in a much more dramatic and urgent and, in fact, worse way in many ways in Afghanistan just 2 years later.
Iraq.
So I think in Iraq. discuss later.
But Phyllis, I wanted to ask you about the refugee issue, and the press coverage of the plight of those trying to get out, the civilians the Afghans trying to get out of the country in the last few weeks. It seems to me there's enormous hypocrisy involved in this kind of coverage. First of all, it's no retreat from a lost war is going to be orderly and well managed. But the issue of refugees, there have been an estimated by the United Nations over 6 million refugees from Afghanistan, about 3.5 million internally displaced, and another 2.6 million who are outside of Afghanistan in other countries. And of those, the United States has only taken in 20,000 over the last 20 years. And we have countries like Pakistan has 1.4 million Afghan refugees, Iran, 780,000 Afghan refugees, even Germany, 180,000. And the United States, which started the war, prosecuted the war, and maintained the occupation, has so far only taken in 20,000 refugees. So this refugee problem is not a new one. It's just only now being focused on by the press.
It's absolutely right. It's not only just being focused on by the press, it's also just being focused on by the government, by a whole host of forces across this country. And you're absolutely right, Juan. This is enormous levels of hypocrisy. The hypocrisy in this war, it's hard to measure how far it goes. But certainly on the question of refugees, that suddenly now the refugees that are coming out are the refugees who are the people who did in many ways benefit. Women in particular did benefit if they lived in Kabul. They benefited in certain ways, in a temporary sense, from access to education, healthcare, and jobs that were not available before. That is real. And the U.S. did make promises that it should have kept. The way this withdrawal was carried out was not just disorganized. It was badly planned. It was terribly done, in my view. But that doesn't go to the question of the hypocrisy on what was the U.S. obligation to those refugees, to the IDPs, to the countries like Pakistan and Iran that were hosting for years millions of refugees. Iran at one point had 2.5 million refugees. Many have left. Some have gone back. We are hearing now from, for example, Mahbouba Siraj, the head of the Afghan Women's Network, who said yesterday she felt an absolute sense of relief seeing the last U.S. forces leaving as a woman. And she said, we are now able to figure out what we're going to do in this new era. I think that we in this country have an enormous debt, not only to the refugees that are coming out this month, but to the people of Afghanistan, whose country we have so devastated, where we have killed tens of thousands of their citizens. So we owe a debt of reparations. We owe compensation. We don't owe continued drone strikes. We don't owe continued attacks from over the horizon, something that is guaranteed to maintain a level of violence and extend the cycles of violence that we have seen in these last 20 years. But certainly the press should be, in every one of these articles, should be focusing on the relationship of all of the refugees, the IDPs, those that are seeking some kind of protected status, asylum, in ways that this country has not been willing to provide.
We're going to wrap in 1 minute, but I wanted to get your comment on President Biden referencing China twice during his speech. This is what he said.
And here's a critical thing to understand. The world is changing. We're engaged in a serious competition with China. We're dealing with the challenges on multiple fronts with Russia. We're confronted with cyber attacks and nuclear proliferation. And there's nothing China or Russia would rather have, would want more in this competition in the United States to be bogged down another decade in Afghanistan.
As we wrap up, clearly the United States is concerned about China and Russia, as he says. China and Russia stepping into the breach in a different way as the U.S. pulls out soldiers. And just to be clear, there's an army there of counterintelligence, of mercenaries. That is not over. So the forever war is not exactly over. But what about China and Russia, Phyllis?
I think that while we saw in 20 years of war in Afghanistan, it proved once again that there is no military solution to terrorism. If our relationship with China and Russia can be based on competing for who can provide the most and the best aid and assistance to the country of Afghanistan that has been so devastated by outside powers led by the United States for so many years, not just this 20 years, but for 20 years before that, that would be a victory, I think, for those of us who fought against this war for 20 years. If we can see a competition between Russia and China and the U.S. for who can provide the most vaccines, instead of what the U.S. is doing right now, preventing the IMF from giving Afghanistan $450 million that was pledged for vaccines and for COVID care, that would be a great thing. That's the kind of competition we should have, that wealthy countries are competing with each other to see who can provide the best and the most effective aid to those in need.
We want to thank you, Phyllis Bennis, author and fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies. Coming up, we speak with an Afghan doctor who just fled Kabul with his wife and 4 children, went to Qatar and Germany, eventually came back home to Virginia. We'll hear his story.
Like that president who lied about WMD. Hundreds of thousands of people are lying in their graves. Celebrities are calling him the sweet new friend they made. Well, what's the deal with all these war criminals out walking around free? I just want to say thank you to those brave women in the squad. By that hate monger and his mom. But when you care about something that's bigger than you, even the fires of hell ain't too much to walk through. And I just want to say thank you to those brave women in the squad.
Going down to Texas by Iris Dement. Coming up, we'll talk about the almost total abortion ban that just went into effect in Texas last night, midnight. But this is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez, and we continue to look at Afghanistan as we're joined by an Afghan doctor who fled Afghanistan last week with his 4 children and his wife. The family was airlifted to Doha, Qatar, after spending days trying to get into the Kabul airport. From Doha, they flew to Germany, then to the United States, arriving Saturday. Dr. Weisadia joins us now. He's the founder of Tabish, a nonprofit that provides mental health care to traumatized Afghans. He and his family have been in Afghanistan since June, visiting family. He's joining us finally from his home in Alexandria, Virginia. Doctor, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you describe your journey, how you got out of Afghanistan with your family?
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. Let me to start before my journey. I'm not the first one victims of this changes in Afghanistan, but subsequently, international community and other people would be in the next future victims of these changes which happened in Afghanistan. It is my belief. So our journey started from a normal day in Afghanistan. We never expected that very soon Kabul will captured by Taliban. And I was busy with my humanitarian work to provide services for a displacement community, which I collected some donation. Randomly, I received the news that the Kabul fall down and the Taliban captured. Immediately, I catch home and I saved my children, and we moved from one place to another place. Really, it was very scary for me because I used to work with United States support projects, and I implemented many projects from USAID side, and also somehow I provided mental health support for a contractor of U.S. military in Afghanistan. It was big concern for me. So our family and friends advised me to move in a safe place. Then I moved to a safe place and I left my own home in order to protect ourselves. And then I tried to come to airport when I received this news that there is chance to evacuate the country. But I went for a couple of days to airport, but I do not success. My daughter fainted in front door of the airport, and I have bitten by Taliban, and it was a lot of violence. Then it was an attempt to success. We came very pity at home, and next day we tried. Same experience happened to us. Finally, it was very shock for me, so I couldn't come out. I contacted the U.S. Embassy and sent email. I do not receive response for a couple of days. Finally, I received an email that you should go midnight in front of one of secret gate of airport, and someone will accompany you, escort you. Unfortunately, it was not the story. When I went to another gate, there was thousand people with their passport, with their travel document. But again, it was same scenario. The Taliban pushed back people, they beat, they shoot directly and indirectly on people. So it was disaster for me. I have bitten by Taliban in front of my children, and my children scream for that. So I spent like a couple of days just over there, and we lay down in the street. We had a little bit food with us because they advised us. We had our clothes and shoes, not more than that. I got some water and some a little bit food with us, but it already finished. Finally, after 2 days, it was a chance. One of the Taliban soldiers said, okay, I allow those who has document. Then by chance, I entered to the gate with my 4 children and my wife, and we walked for 45 minutes inside of the Ministry of Interior. We have seen a lot of broken car, furnitures, and many more office equipment, but there was no one inside of the ministry. And we walked like for 45 minutes to catch the last gate of airport, which there was a U.S. soldier, and they welcomed us, and they gave us a little bit water and checked our passport. Then we went to the airport, and the bus transport us to the military terminal. Then after passport control, even it was not like official passport control, just they checked an ID, that a person should have an ID. Then they sent us in front of the ramp. So we spent almost 9 to 10 hours because it was like very tragic for me. I don't remember the exact time how much we spent, but it was whole day that we spent in sand, and there was no shadow, no place to protect the children. Honestly, it was disaster for us. Finally, late night, Air Force plane came, and then we got that, and we moved to Qatar, and we spent 24 hours in Qatar, a U.S. base. Then they transport us from Qatar to Germany, and from Germany, finally, we catch Dallas, and we came to home. Total, we almost spent 5 days from Kabul to U.S., but it was disaster for me and for my children.
And Dr. Adi, I wanted to ask you, in terms of the fall of the Afghan government that came so rapidly. You had flown into the country in June. Were you shocked and surprised by not only by the way that the Taliban overran most of the country, but also the fact that the government leaders fled and left the people to fend for themselves?
I think the government and structure was not trustable for people. Inside of the government, people was disappointed, especially from Mr. Ghani. He had a lot of nepotism inside of his structure and system. But people never expected that in a very short time the system will fall down and everything totally change. Even Taliban never expected that how they will success very easily to capture Kabul.
Dr. Waisadia, we reached your eldest son last night to ask him about his experience fleeing Kabul.
My name is Mustafa. I'm 13 years old and I'm in 9th grade. We just came from Afghanistan and we actually went through a lot of trauma. When we were coming from Afghanistan, I actually wanted to bring my piano because like I play music and because I was really afraid to bring it. So I just left it there, and when the Taliban came, I was really scared to play it, and sometimes I would like get angry because like we were scared of them. The Taliban could literally do anything to us, kill us, like hurt us, seriously hurt us, and don't allow us to leave the country. So I was pretty much like I was I like in my head I had this picture of me getting hurt.
So that's Mustafa, Dr. Waisadia's 13-year-old son, who is an accomplished pianist, couldn't bring back his piano, was so afraid. And as we wrap up, Dr. Adia, you treat traumatized Afghans. After these 20 years of the U.S. war and occupation, how do people recover?
I think let us be optimistic, but to be honest, there is no hope, especially for myself. I spent all my life to help people, but you know, when I came out from Afghanistan, I came with a bunch of accumulative trauma, my children, myself. So I was very pity. I could not talk anything about and imagine about the situation. Dr. Judy from Columbia University, she helped us a lot, at least I recover and I should talk and should be a speak man of my country. So in my belief, there is no hope for the future. Taliban do not change. We already noticed what they're doing. Unfortunately, it is reality. They become more empowered compared to 2 decades past. And they're talking from a power of authorization at the moment, and whatever they want, they can decide it. There is no hope. Even just they talk in front of media, okay, we will give the woman right, the human right, and other civil rights. But I'm not optimistic for that. One of the examples is my 13 years child. So he could not play just a basic music instrument. And, you know, I became aggressive on him. He wanted to play on those days which Taliban was in the country, and I put it in a safe place. How we can trust on them that the music is something give people calm and relax. So we cannot listen to music, or the woman cannot go out to work. So at the moment, the women are at home. They are not going to their work. They are not going to university. What is the reason? There is no excuse for them to keep them at home. So they allow the men to go to work, and they already announced everyone can come to their work and resume their job. But why they do not call for women? This is one of the issue, and they do not respect the human right. So we have a big independent commission of human rights. No one is working for that. And the same time, the media and the democracy, journalism, all these things are collapsed at the moment. They says we will give the right and we will support this, but based on the Islam entire policy or legal framework.
Well,
but what is that?
We want to thank you so much, Dr. Waisadia. Of course, we'll continue to follow what happens. Dr. Adia, a medical doctor who just evacuated from Kabul with his 4 children and his wife, founder of the nonprofit Tabish, which helps marginalized communities in Afghanistan, as well as youth soldiers recovering from the psychological trauma of war. Next up, the Supreme Court has allowed a near total ban on abortion to go into effect in Texas. Stay with us.
I'm going down to sing in Texas where anybody can carry a gun. But we will all be so much safer there, the biggest lie under the sun. Go ahead and shoot me if it floats your little boat, but I'll live by my conscience even if that's all she wrote. I'm going down to sing in Texas where anybody can carry a gun. Way too long coming, but I want to thank the chicks.
Going down to Texas by Iris Dement. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez as we turn to a major setback for reproductive rights. As of midnight last night, the U.S. Supreme Court allowed a Texas law to go into effect that bans abortion after 6 weeks. No other 6-week ban has ever gone into effect in the United States. At 6 weeks, many people don't even know they're pregnant. Conservative Justice Samuel Alito refused to rule on an emergency petition filed by abortion providers seeking to block the so-called Heartbeat Act, which was signed into law by Texas Governor Greg Abbott in May. The law is seen as a direct challenge to Roe v. Wade, the landmark 1973 Supreme Court ruling that enshrined the right of women to choose to have an abortion by striking down Texas laws that criminalize the procedure. The new Texas law is unique. It empowers private citizens, not government officials, to file a civil lawsuit against patients, medical workers, or even a patient's family or friends who, quote, aid and abet an abortion, or a taxi driver who drives a woman to a clinic. If a case is successful, the person who filed it is awarded at least $10,000 plus attorney's fees. For more, we're joined by Nancy Northup, President and CEO of the Center for Reproductive Rights. Can you talk about the gravity of the threat to Roe v. Wade? Is this the most extreme law that's ever been enacted in the United States, Nancy?
Well, it's the most extreme that's ever gone into effect. And as you pointed out, this morning, unfortunately, in Texas, the clinics can't be open to provide abortions any later than 6 weeks. And 85% of people seeking abortions in Texas do so after 6 weeks, since many people don't even know they're pregnant yet at 6 weeks. So this is the most extreme law to go into effect. We have gone to the Supreme Court. We filed papers right up to 8 o'clock last night. We are waiting for the court to act. And it really should step in. I mean, what Texas has done is just blanket unconstitutional. It is not for the state of Texas to overturn Roe versus Wade. Unfortunately, that power does land with the Supreme Court, and we're fighting another case in the Supreme Court from Mississippi on that very question, where Mississippi has asked the Supreme Court to overturn Roe versus Wade. But Roe versus Wade is the law of the land. It has been for 50 years. And right now, clinic doors can't be open. You know, our client, Whole Women's Health, was open until 11:59 p.m. last night, seeing patients, because people wanted to get in and exercise their right and make the decisions for their life, health, and future right up to the midnight hour.
Well, some people say that this case obviously could determine the fate of Roe v. Wade via the court's shadow docket. Could you explain what the shadow docket is?
Absolutely. Obviously, in ordinary cases, like the case in Mississippi that the Supreme Court will hear about Mississippi's abortion ban, a party applies to the court to hear a case. The court decides whether they will or not. They announce that. Months later, we file briefs. Then there's an oral argument. Then the court renders a decision, and we all read that decision. And what the shadow docket is things like now, where we have a motion practice going on at the Supreme Court. Here, Texas, clearly unconstitutional law. I mean, there's just no question about that. I want to make sure your viewers understand. There is no question that a ban on abortion at 6 weeks violates the Constitution. That something like this, because of the way the Court of Appeals did not let the district court go ahead and render its decision in the case, the law is in effect. We go up on an emergency motion to the Supreme Court. If they don't act, which is where we are right this moment, the Supreme Court has not acted, the law goes into effect. So what they mean by shadow docket is instead of a full hearing in the public's view, we know it's coming. Overnight, literally overnight, since midnight last night, abortion can't be accessed for most people in the state of Texas. So that's why it's called a shadow docket, and it's very, very disturbing. And we are still, the Supreme Court still can act in this case. Our papers are still pending with the court. And so we are, on pins and needles, waiting for the court to act. But
or
meanwhile,
it could stop it at any point. But Nancy Northup, if you could explain further how extreme this law is. People may not understand. A person on the street can say, I see her walking into that women's health clinic. I'm going to sue her. They don't know who this person is. Explain what this means. Just a cab driver driving someone. And also, we're even wrong in saying 6 weeks, right? It's called a heartbeat bill. If they hear a heartbeat at 5 weeks, you could be stopped from having an abortion.
That's right. So because this is an unconstitutional law, you can't ban abortion at 6 weeks. Courts have struck these down easily in other states. Texas did something very underhanded, which is they said, we're not going to enforce this as a state of Texas. We're going to empower. We're going to empower individuals, really, the anti-choice activists in Texas. We're going to empower them to enforce this. And they can do that by, as you pointed out, suing anyone. They can sue the doctor. They can sue a clinic staff member who checks a patient in. They can sue your sister who drives you to your appointment. They could sue a friend who loans you some money to be able to get the procedure. And it's absolutely crazy. They can sue you. You have an abortion in Dallas. They can sue you in Houston and drag you into court, far from even where you live. And they can file lawsuits against you in, over 200 jurisdictions in Texas. So this is clearly intended to harass, obviously, providers, but also the support system of a person seeking an abortion, out of being able to help them at all. And to put even more outrage on this, there's $10,000 that these vigilantes who are going to be enforcing this unconstitutional ban, they are entitled to $10,000 when they go to court, and you would have to pay their attorney's fees. So if you're that sister who drove your sister to the clinic, you have to pay their attorney's fees, $10,000. And of course, it doesn't work the other way around when you win in a court because of this. Your attorney's fees aren't paid. So it is really designed to circumvent, number one, judicial review, which is why we're stuck right now in the Supreme Court. But second, it is designed to, again, both stop providers from being able to provide services, and also friends, families, and supporters to support a person who is seeking to get an abortion. And just to underscore again, this is constitutionally protected. It's as if Texas just said, you can't vote, right? And we're going to, we're going to enforce that by vigilantes who sue you if you vote.
Nancy Northup, I wanted to ask you, what happens now in Texas right now if a woman needs or believes that she needs to have an abortion? Must she go out of state? And if so, can they even, can this law take, can people sue them even if they go out of state to have an abortion?
Okay, so first let me just say, if your listeners in Texas, if you are in this position, do call your local clinics, right? They are open. Because there is this small period in which you can get an abortion, and they do want to help their patients. So, of course, before you do anything, call your local clinic. And secondly, you can leave the state. They can't criminalize you leaving the state to have an abortion. But, of course, for so many people, they don't have the means to do that, right? You have to not only have the financial means to leave the state, you have to be able to take time off from work. You have to potentially have childcare. Most women in Texas who have abortions do have children. And there's a whole set of circumstances that are going to make that very difficult. So, again, everybody needs to be up in arms about this. I think it has been a very busy news cycle with very, very big news, legitimate big news in Afghanistan and with Hurricane Ida. But this is really important for people to understand that we need to be quite vocal, that we are not going to go backward in this country from a right that's been protected for over 50 years.
Nancy Northup, we want to thank you for being with us, President and CEO of the Center for Reproductive Rights. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. 2 weeks after a massive earthquake hit southern Haiti, thousands of survivors are growing desperate as they continue to face shortages of food, shelter, and medicine. This is a resident of Les Cayes.
My house was destroyed by the earthquake. Several of my family members died. I had 13 goats, 11 died. I have 2 left. I came to the market to see if I can sell the 2 that remain. We have nothing. We need help.
As Haitians cope with the earthquake's aftermath and the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse in July, a coalition of over 300 rights groups here in the U.S. sent a letter Monday to the Biden administration urging it to halt all deportations to Haiti and expand TPS, that's temporary protected status. They say more Haitians have been deported since Biden took office than during all of fiscal year 2020. We go right now to Guerline Joseph, co-founder and executive director of Haitian Bridge Alliance. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Guerline. These are very, very dire times in Haiti. Can you explain what's happening? Are people actually being deported to Haiti right now?
Good morning, Amy, and thank you so much for having us back. We are getting a lot of calls from our clients who are in immigration detention, stating that they are being told to pack their things because they are getting ready to deport them. It is extremely alarming, given the fact that, as you mentioned earlier, we are barely starting to recover from the earthquake and the hurricane that literally ravaged the country 2 weeks ago, followed by the assassination of President Jovenel Moïse back in July 7th. So we are alarmed. We are extremely concerned, as the Biden administration did promise that they were not going to be having any deportations to Haiti. But what we are hearing from our clients is very alarming, because they are being told that they will be deported soon. And we have to be alarmed because literally a month after the assassination and 2 days prior to the earthquake, they did send 2 planes to Haiti full of asylum seekers, including children and babies. Over 135 people were deported back to Haiti literally a few weeks after the assassination.
And can you talk about the issue that asylum seekers are having in terms of if they attempt to come in through Mexico? That's a more recent route that Haitian asylum seekers have been taking?
Yes, so since 2015, we started seeing Haitian migrants arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border, and that was under President Obama. And the majority of them were put in detention and eventually pulled in. But on August 28, 2016, we saw a turn of events where they were no longer given a humanitarian parole, but they were being put in immigration detention and then deported. Things got really, really hard under President Trump, where, the border got closed indefinitely, and the use of Title 42 starting last year, MPP literally closing the entire border. And what we started seeing is, because of policies enacted in the United States, the wall kept moving further down, all the way to Panama, all the way to Guatemala, all the way to Nicaragua, where people were blocked from continuing their journey, very deadly journey. They were blocked from continuing the journey to make it to the U.S.-Mexico border to ask for asylum. And what we continue to advocate on behalf of the people who have found themselves at the U.S.-Mexico border since 2015, 2016, who have been waiting for over 5 years, is to get access to be able to come and ask for asylum. And we also see, a new arrival of people coming by boat. And we understand how Secretary Mayorkas, Vice President Harris, and President Biden keep telling on people do not come. If they come, they will be intercepted and turned back. But how do you tell somebody not to come when they are dealing not only with man-made crisis, political crisis and violence, and on top of it, dealing with natural disasters like the earthquake and the storm that just, devastated the country 2 weeks ago.
And speaking of the earthquake, what are you hearing is the assistance that the international community is providing, especially considering the terrible scandal over the last major earthquake in Haiti of all the stolen aid and the corruption that ensued in supposed international assistance?
We are really strongly advocating against, so that we don't see a repeat of what happened in 2010. For example, how do we work directly with impacted community members on the ground to provide direct assistance for them? What the Haitian Women Alliance and many other communities within the diaspora are doing is working hand in hand with organizations, Haitian organizations on the ground, local community members to provide humanitarian assistance and see how we can help rebuild structural sound structures so that we can make sure that when, not if, now that we know how prone that Haiti is to earthquake and other natural disasters, how do we support structure that will withstand earthquakes so that we can save lives? So we are looking at now the aftermath relief, where we provide direct assistance for the Haitian Women Alliance is giving direct cash assistance in the hands of the most vulnerable so that they can rebuild, so that they can be able to bury their loved ones, like the gentleman you heard earlier today speaking about him losing everything, including his goats. That is the livelihood. That's what they use to be able to send their children to school. So what we are doing is providing direct assistance to those people so that they can at least be able to survive the next few months. But at the same time, how do we make sure we provide assistance that will be long-lasting? Make sure that we have the proper road. When something like that happens again, we are able to quickly reach the people in the remote locations. How do we make sure that we have schools and hospitals to treat those who are unfortunately victims of both natural disasters and man-made disasters? But what we are seeing right now is dire.
So, Guerline, you have a country that is facing perhaps massive hunger from climate change, from the hurricane, from the disruption of people's lives. And is there a functioning government? Because we are also coming out of the assassination of the president of Haiti, assassinated by, among them, Colombian mercenaries, some of them trained by the United States. Has that also been put on hold, that investigation, as this latest crisis is developed? And amazingly, people are being sent back into this catastrophe.
Amy, thank you so much for bringing that up. As we've been pushing through recovery, rescue, search and rescue, from what we are seeing, the Haitian government is almost non-existent. We are not getting daily briefings of what's happening on the ground from the government. Once again, the country, the people on the ground are the one trying to push through and making sure that people are okay. I am not an expert on that matter. However, based on what we are seeing, we do not have a functioning government, which we all knew after the assassination of the president, even before that.
We have 15 seconds, Guerline, sorry.
Yes, we were struggling to recover from all the political turmoil, but right now we are asking for support on the ground to be able to move forward from those disasters, both man-made and natural disasters. But as you mentioned, Amy, we still are not seeing the help that we need from the Haitian government right now.
Yerline Joseph, we want to thank you for being with us, co-founder and executive director of Haitian Bridge Alliance. Democracy Now! Is produced with Renee Fels, Mike Bartina, Gester Messiah Rhodes, Nermeen Sheikh. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Stay safe, wear a mask.